This is the most exciting time in my entire career. And I think that is a result of the questions that can be answered today that we couldn't answer before.
We're able to see connections in areas that once seemed totally separate.
Julia, we've just met, but we have something in common. We've both been obsessed with consciousness our whole lives. I did a PhD in neurophysiology, and I don't think I understood consciousness any more when I finished the degree than when I started the degree. Why is consciousness so baffling?
Because it's everything we have, all we are. So when I need to talk about consciousness, like now, I always say, what is it first, so we understand what it is. And as I said, it is everything. I define it as what goes away in the evening when you go to sleep and comes back the next morning when you wake up. And sometimes it comes back during the night when you dream. So consciousness is all we experience. And of course, if you eliminate experience from everything else, nothing is left as far as each of us is concerned. So experience means all the sounds and sights of life. It means all the feelings you might have had, will have, all the thoughts, all the wishes. Of course, it means yourself, your friends, your country, your place in the world. Everything is an experience. There's nothing but an experience for each of us. So that's consciousness.
The ideas for a proper confirmed scientific theory of not just human consciousness, but animal consciousness, and by extension, machine consciousness, if that's possible. Stay tuned. It's things are happening very fast.
Well,
these days.
So the process from going from brain to mind is a difficult one.
It is important to study the brain, but you will never squeeze the essence of consciousness out of gray matter. You can squeeze it as a sponge as much as you want. You will never get experience flowing out of it because suddenly there is some special property of the neurons firing at 40 hertz or whatever else that might be that suddenly generates experience. And this is why philosophers have rightly pointed out for a long time that this is a very hard problem. In fact, it is so hard that I grant you it is impossible to solve that way. You cannot solve the problem of consciousness by looking at the brain, taking it in your hands, and asking yourself, how could this piece of gray matter give rise to the phantasmagory, the colors, and the beauty and the shapes of experience? You will not squeeze it out of that. You need to take a different approach.
Hi everyone, this is Kasia Bosne, and in today's interview I have a pleasure to speak to Dr. Eben Alexander, international best-selling author.
It was impossible after impossible after impossible.
Eben Alexander, a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon, and he now carries the memory of what he says was a journey that all his scientific training cannot explain.
And there are a lot of scientists out there who get this, those who study consciousness and realize very deeply that the physicalist model that brain creates consciousness fails miserably. It is coming to an end. It is too simplistic and doesn't offer up anything to explain the observations about day-to-day consciousness or about what one might call rogue phenomena, like near-death experiences, shared death experiences.
Since Napoleonic times, surgeons like I have had the challenge of controlling bleeding in wounded people. I want you to understand a little bit of what that is like by taking you with me through one of the more harrowing cases of my career. It's 3 a.m. in a big American trauma hospital. I'm the surgeon on call. And we get notice that a gunman has gone to a student's party and started shooting people. As the most senior doctor on the floor, I gathered the team together and I assessed every patient as they came through. I then turned my attention to the most serious one, a 15-year-old boy named Mark, who, although conscious, was wide-eyed with fear and speaking in short, breathless words. I knew that he would need to go to the operating theatre fast. As he slipped into unconsciousness, we slid in a breathing tube and raced him off to the operating room. But in fact, he didn't get there. And during this period, a number of things happened. The first is that the body mobilises all those incredible survival reflexes that have made us such resilient organisms. When you bleed, three important things happen. Your blood clots to plug the hole, your blood vessels constrict to divert blood away to the vital organs, and your heart beats faster and your breathing goes faster to try and increase oxygenation. This is like the event horizon that surrounds a black hole, the point at which the gravitational pull is so strong that there is no longer any chance of escaping its clutches. Now, I hope you've got a bit of understanding about the dying process. I've looked after thousands of injured patients since, and sadly, I've seen that same sort of situation happen a number of times. Arriving alive, but critically ill, and in the end not making it, not because we didn't know what to do, but because we didn't have time to do it. And it's also given me a rather peculiar perspective on life and death and the transition from one to the other. And I can tell you, it's very different to the way it's usually portrayed in the movies. It often happens over a period of minutes, sometimes as many as 20 or 30 minutes, where the patient enters a sort of eerie biological twilight zone. It is a bit like dusk, which is neither day nor night. He or she is neither fully living nor yet passed away. In over 10 years, as a surgeon specialising in the care of severely injured people, I've had more than a few times that I've sought divine intervention. Most often it's been in the operating theatre when I've been doing everything I can.
Here's a question. Do you believe in heaven? Various polls find that somewhere around 80% of Americans do. But a Harvard-trained brain surgeon wasn't so sure until he spent a week in a coma and came out with an incredible description of the afterlife.
They have been touched by a medical miracle, and maybe more.
Okay, well, I did my doctorate in neurophysiology, as I mentioned. I have many neuroscientist friends, and many people are interested in this problem, obviously. And the path that they always go is, how can the brain explain the mind? Why is the output of the brain the mind? And many different theories from neuroscientists, most of whom believe that the firing of electrical impulses, the flow of chemicals across synapses between the neurons, in some sense, maybe gross electrical activities across brain areas. In some sense, the activities of the neurons themselves, circuitry, whole brain areas. In some sense, consciousness is a product of all of that. That's their assumption, but they never, ever make any progress on what it feels like in terms of the inner experience.
So we have learned a great deal about this relationship between our brain and our consciousness, no doubt about that, especially in the past 20 years, but even prior to that. But there are many things that remain exceedingly mysterious. that's consciousness. And if we weren't in a way for sleep and sometimes for anesthesia, we probably wouldn't even know that it is such an extraordinary gift, how else to call it. Meaning, if it weren't there, for each of us, there would be nothing at all. In fact, none of us would exist in a fundamental sense. Okay? So if you want to call what's really an illusion, that's up to you. But I think we have to stick with the notion that consciousness is the one thing we're absolutely sure about. Now, within that, there is an intriguing phenomenon that was pointed out by Schopenhauer. So if you start from consciousness, at some point you realize, and we have realized it quite some time ago, that there is a particular piece in my experience, which is my brain, we now know, that if I touch that, then consciousness itself seems to vanish. So there is this wonderful display, like this jungle here in which we are, and this conversation we are having, these people we are seeing, and I feel my body, and I sort of see things out of my eyes. And all of this, we now have come to believe, depends on something inside my skull, that if I knock it out, just as you said, sort of everything disappears. So in the great theater of consciousness, of experience, there seems to be one place inside here which is responsible for the theater itself. And that is, of course, what gave rise to the mind-body problem that Descartes sort of put out in the open quite clearly.
I'm a psychiatrist, philosopher of emotions, ethicist, so I have to say part of what I think people are really worried about is neither consciousness or intelligence, but the self. And what is the self? And will we be able to become? Will that be replaced?
So how do you differentiate among those?
Well, I think that the way that Yuval just defined consciousness, which is different than Daniel's definition of consciousness, is closer to my definition of the self. So I don't care about the semantics. So I think we're pretty compatible, I think, in our views of a lot of this. But I think that what I would just point out is that I know there are people, even at Davos, who are creating companies to try to create empathic AI, and I really agree with Daniel that that's a big mistake, that we really should be using AI as a tool, not as a companion.
I would say that intelligence is the ability to solve problems, consciousness is the ability to feel things, to have subjective experiences like love and hate and fear and so forth. The confusion between intelligence and consciousness is understandable because in humans they go together. We solve most problems through feelings, but in computers they could be completely separated. So we might have super intelligence without any consciousness whatsoever.
I agree.
Vince Lombardi, the famous baseball coach, once described after one of his team's losses, "We didn't lose the game, we just ran out of time." And with that, I'd like you to share with me some of the excitement of modern technologies and what they're now about to do for us. More than that, though, technology is also giving us more time. And it's doing that by interfering at the end of life processes and pushing the event horizon further away. I must say that tinkering with the limits of life does at times feel a bit like playing God.
So how is it that this little piece of furniture in the great assembly of the world inside my skull is responsible for the world itself? That is, in two words, the mind-body problem.
There's a tremendous amount of information out there about non-local consciousness, about all these phenomena that suggest that the brain does not create consciousness at all. Of course, the brain and consciousness are tightly linked, but the mistake is in thinking that the brain creates it. And what all of these observations suggest, and that includes the day-to-day observations around consciousness itself, just in a moment-to-moment function, is that consciousness is non-local and that it is fundamental. This is part of where, as I said earlier, the enigma around quantum mechanics really has the most facile solution is through acknowledging that consciousness is fundamental in the universe. And that's where the science is headed around all of this.
All right, but there's some factual basis to that claim, because what seems to me to be a unified sense of visuals in this beautiful, strange place we're in, the smells, the sounds are all integrated together in one experience. But if I had hit on the brain, or I had a trauma or a stroke, any one of these can be knocked out. And so pieces of this could disappear. And the claim is that we have all these independent systems that are unified in some interesting way for maybe evolutionary purposes, but in fact they're all coming together, and because of that, it's an illusion that I have this unified sense of consciousness when it's all these independent activities that somehow get unified together.
Well, it's not an illusion at all. As I said, it's the only thing that is, I like to say, really real. Okay? So if you want to call what's real an illusion, that's up to you.
A mild afternoon in Lynchburg, Virginia, and Eben and Holly Alexander are at a high school soccer game cheering on their 14-year-old son, Bond. They are a perfectly ordinary American family with an extraordinary story. They have been touched by a medical miracle, and maybe more.
I mean, it was impossible after impossible after impossible.
Eben Alexander, a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon who was a skeptic when it came to religion, survived a near-death experience, and he now carries the memory of what he says was a journey to heaven, a journey that all his scientific training cannot explain.
They realized that my neocortex, the human part of the brain, was being devastated by this bacterial meningitis.
And the rest of his verbalization was purely screaming.
Eben Alexander had been stricken with an extremely rare and virulent E. coli meningitis infection that was ravaging his brain, plunging him into a coma.
And so it should have gotten rid of all but the most rudimentary of any kind of experience. According to our modern views, neuroscientific views of the brain and the neocortex, the part that makes us human, the outer part of the brain, that's the part that's most specifically attacked by bacterial meningitis, which really makes that kind of severe meningitis a perfect model for human death.
Doctors gave him almost no chance to live and told his family if he did survive, he'd be brain damaged for the rest of his life.
Now it turns out that totally shocking to my prior self and to the belief of brain creates consciousness was what happened deep in coma. And what I remembered began in what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm, like being underground or in dirty jello. It seemed to go on for a very long time. And I think in looking back on it, that earthworm eye view was the best consciousness that my brain could muster while the neocortex was being destroyed by this aggressive, primitive bacterial meningitis. It turns out that what happens next is really kind of the big surprise of the journey, because in fact, as I was down on that bottom with that very limited neurologic function, and in fact, in that earthworm eye view, I had no memory of the life of Eben Alexander. I could remember nothing of my earthly existence, remembered no words, no language, none of my scientific knowing, none of my religious concepts. Everything got wiped out. And initially, when I came back to this world and was trying to understand it all, I thought, well, that makes sense that I would remember nothing of my life because my whole neocortex was destroyed. My doctors knew that very well from my exams. In fact, to this day, by the end of the week, I was down to a 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. And so that's why so much of this has been a deep mystery that demanded my attention and trying to understand it all. Now it turns out that I was rescued from that earthworm eye view by this slowly spinning white light and a perfect musical melody that took me up into that beautiful, idyllic, ultra-real Gateway Valley.
It's a beautiful vision, but heaven?
A lot of people are going to say, Doctor, it was a hallucination. Your brain got zapped by this disease, all the wires got crossed, and you saw a girl on a butterfly wing and you were spinning up in a melody.
I know this was not a hallucination, not a dream, not what we call a confabulation. I know that it really occurred, and I know it occurred outside of my brain. So basically,
But how? How can he even suggest that, much less claim that his experience is proof of heaven, as he's called his new book? He showed us his brain scan.
it wasn't leaving any part of my cortex unaffected.
So your conclusion is because all of this outer area, which is the higher functioning, was covered with the infection, what you experienced in the coma wasn't part of the brain.
Right.
When I came back, I described all those celestial beings that were emanating these beautiful hymns as angelic choirs. I mean, that's what makes the most sense. That ultra-real valley was the real challenge to explain. It had the Earth-like features, but it was far more real than this world. And that part is very hard to explain. And in the months after my coma, when I was trying to explain all this as some kind of a brain-based hallucination or dream or drug effect, it was a real challenge to explain that ultra-reality. And the way that it comes out is so profound, the way we can know things. And that was just the beginning of my journey.
But something else happened. After he recovered, Eben, who was adopted, saw a picture of a sister from his biological family who died years ago, a woman he never knew.
And I knew who my guardian angel was on the butterfly wing. It was the most profound experience I've ever had in this life.
Your sister, by birth, and from a family that you didn't know because you were adopted, who died several years ago, who you had never met, you saw while you were in coma.
Yes. And that was the key. That explained everything.
Smells good, that's for sure.
Dinner time at the Alexander home.
Come, Lord Jesus, our guest to be, and bless us.
They were not a particularly religious family before Eben's coma. He was a skeptic. Not anymore.
And when you hear those stories, it is fundamentally earth-shattering what it really means. But the truth is, this is an entire reworking of what we understand as the nature of reality, and realizing that the material realm is in many ways very much the illusion. And the thing that truly exists is soul, spirit, consciousness.
This proves that our soul, our consciousness, our spirit doesn't depend on the existence of the brain and body at all, and easily is actually freed up to a much higher state of knowing when it's freed from this body.
But it's important to be open. You know, I get into that in Map of Heaven, the whole issue of synchronicity, all the focus that Carl Jung placed on synchronicity. And to me, it's a crucial part of getting to the meaning that we can all find in our existence here. As individuals, as soul groups, as nations, as ethnic groups, all of humanity and beyond. It's all about showing up, paying attention, and being aware of that meaning that is there.